Welcome everybody to this session. My name is Axel Helmstaedter. I'm the current president of the International Society for the History of Pharmacy, and I'm very happy to have been asked to chair this session. The session title is Contested Drug Markets, comprising 3 presentations. As far as I see from the abstracts, we will hear news about some kind of a never-ending story. The ambivalence of drugs and medicines between hope and harm, and a different reputation between being praised and condemned. Already the Greek term pharmakon, meaning medicine and poison simultaneously, points to the character of drugs as double-edged swords. In medical, pharmaceutical and drug regulatory practice, they are used to act only after careful evaluation of the benefit-risk ratio of drugs to be used or to be licensed. So we will discuss different aspects of the core topic for all health professionals here, and I'm happy to welcome 3 distinguished speakers in this session. The organizer advised me to announce that there should be only one summarizing discussion of all 3 presentations at the end. For questions, please use the chat window of the software. We are also advised to strictly limit presentation time to 15 minutes each. Not to waste time, I would like to go forward to introduce the first speaker. Our first presenter is Richard Del Rio. He received his bachelor and master's degrees at Rutgers University, received his PhD, and is currently working at the University of Chicago in the field of U.S. African American and Latin history. The title of his presentation, following immediately after this introduction, Since When is Being a Drug Dealer a Bad Thing? Race and the Criminalization of a Title in Early 20th Century America. Richard, we are looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Axel. Just want to make sure that I can be heard and that people can see what I'm turning on the full screen. Is that showing? 1 second, please. Okay. I believe I'm heard, and I want to say hello, everyone. I am Richard Del Rio. I am one of the provost postdoctoral fellows at Florida State University's College of Medicine. And I'd like to, given the time that we're in, I'd like to just start off by expressing appreciation for this event. I'm very happy to be here and share the new things I'm working on with my colleagues in the field. Given that so much of the hardship that has hit our community over the past few months, I'm very appreciative of the ambitious and capable leadership at the AIHP and UW Madison School of Pharmacy for putting on what I think is going to be a great event. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what my forthcoming article is coming out and some of the new directions that it's taking me in terms of my larger book manuscript, which is an attempt to kind of tell us a market history of narcotic regulation in the early 20th century that grounds these narcotics within the context of a broader drug market and the interests and tensions of a broader, more general drug market. When I first started reading history as an undergraduate, I was so enthralled in the story and dramatic details of historical change that I fooled myself into wondering if I would ever live in interesting times. Now, I conceive of my historical research as an attempt at understanding a present social catastrophe. From all the fields of the social sciences and humanities, scholars have scrutinized drug war politics and sought out explanations for the violence, explanations for the troubling relationship between an explosion of incarcerations, an emergent carceral capitalism, and the racially disparate outcomes they produce. Now the field has learned that this period in the late 20th century that featured intense public investment into the war on drugs coincided with the same years the contemporary opioid crisis was bubbling under our collective notice. This detail inspires new questions to uncover the history of drug war politics. It was the iatrogenic opioid crisis of the late 19th century that served as the political justification for strict federal narcotic prohibition. After all, iatrogenic addiction was a problem federal narcotic prohibition was meant, in theory, to prevent. So, wanting to build a long understanding of the historical interrelationship between the worlds that grew out from the market's legal and illegal divide, I began researching on the business of drugs in the 19th century, before the regulatory involvement of municipal police forces, asking the question, when and how did being a drug dealer become such a bad thing? And this is just a brief overview of what's forthcoming before I talk about the new directions I'm taking. And what I found in the article cited on the screen is that the increasing dominance of mass-produced proprietary medicines and the proliferation of mass retail organizations in the late 19th century were important catalysts for the politics of narcotic control. I found that in Illinois, the historical process of carving criminal spheres out of an unregulated drug market moved in close timing when pharmacies struggled through industrial change. Once very resistant to regulating the prerogatives of licensed drugstores, activists within pharmacy's professionalization movement made strides in political organizing during the late 19th century. That period produced a sizable network of retail druggists to politically tap into. Retail druggists that stocked their shelves with popular proprietary medicines that they did not make, that they acquired from wholesalers on the terms of credit, and that they sold at decreasing prices. At this point in time, the most complained about drug dealer among pharmacy trade papers was not the one selling cocaine, but the quote-unquote cutter, the dealer selling at reduced prices. In terms of the drugs that casually became classified as narcotics, cocaine was not the most commercially valuable in Illinois drugstores at the turn of the 20th century. Morphine held that position. But cocaine's regulation held tremendous political value. State cocaine regulations were the first instance in which the law leveraged wholesalers and manufacturers to consider the interests of the organized retail trade. Since the postbellum period, retail druggists were at a collective disadvantage in relation to the other organized branches of the drug industry. My research found that these economic circumstances ushered in a modernizing moment for Chicago's drug market in 1906, when the organized interests of retail pharmacists coalesced with the interests of social reformers on a campaign aimed at recruiting the city's criminal justice institutions for waging a war on dope. Now, that's kind of the overview. For the purposes of this talk, the police are of secondary importance in explaining how dealers across Chicago's legal and legal market boundary intersected and sustained each other. For that purpose, the entry of the police is significant because they serve to better bond these worlds to the broader system of criminal justice institutions. In this instance, I'm thinking particularly about the jails and prisons, which I believe can tell us a great deal about the operations of the market, not just in political economic sense. Prisons close the loop on the circulation of people, criminalized commodities, and legitimate capital that mark our contemporary American drug market regime, but for methodological reasons and other historical payoffs. Currently, I'm researching prison sources for my book manuscript to excavate the network of people that sustain delegitimized consumption, to get a sense of their history, their division of labor, and observe the operating patterns that emerged over time. For example, prison records reveal how the illegal market of 100 years ago was, in similar fashion to today, sustained by a network of interests that cross cultural and socioeconomic boundaries. Let's consider, for example, the case of an American man from Chicago named Al Lehman, who, while serving time in the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, was bureaucratically identified as prisoner 10532. Committed for violating the Harrison Narcotics Act, Lehman's prisoner file generically listed his occupation as clerk upon his entry to the federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas on January 7, 1916. His brother Henry was a licensed druggist, operating a store at the corners of West Madison and Desplain Street, and although Lehman admitted to selling narcotics illegally for years, at the moment of his capture in October of 1915, he denied that his brother ever gave him dope to sell. Whether this allegation is true or false, federal initially did not need Henry Lehman to indict and convict his brother Al on 8 counts. They had a cooperative witness identifying him as the ringleader of a Midwestern fraternity of dope dealers. And the cocaine hydrochloride they found in Lehman's safety deposit vault possessed Park Davis & Company's proprietary labels. The stashed bottles of cocaine hydrochloride, reportedly valued at $400, was part of a larger portion heisted from Park Davis & Company's Chicago distribution center 4 months earlier. Among the 8 other men and 5 women that were arrested in October for the $3,000 heist, a back of a napkin calculation puts that at about $76,000 today. Lehman had the clearest connection to the knowledge and pharmaceutical sources needed to successfully facilitate the distribution of American manufactured cocaine, especially 4 months after the Harrison Act had gone into effect. Authorities pinpointed Lehman as the mastermind of a diverse and capacious distribution network. For this reason, Lehman was the only offender committed to federal penitentiary, while his colleagues were all sent to serve less time in county indictments. Now, this is just 2 examples of the 14 people that were involved in that heist in 1915. What stands out about these characters is that they kind of disappear from the record. You have here Benny Green, who supposedly, according to the commissioner, was a cooperative witness. And then you had Richard Windy Dick Bulger, who was a colleague of Lehman's. And these characters kind of fade away, so far in my research, they fade away from the historical record after being sentenced to these county institutions. And it's precisely because Lehman was committed to serve at Leavenworth that I, as a historian, can still extract fuzzy details about his colleagues who have eluded me thus far. The surveillance system at Leavenworth kept metadata on his letters, all the letters of all prisoners, and revealed that Lehman had kept correspondence with a friend named Alonzo Blue. And you can see Alonzo Blue. I don't know if anyone can see the mouse circling here, but you can see him. Alonzo Blue here is on this lower left-hand corner. Alonzo was bureaucratically known as prisoner number 10856. And Blue had happened to complete his drug dealing sentence at the tail end of Lehman's. Upon his release in January of 1917, Blue had sent 2 letters to Lehman. The last one received on February 4th of 1917. Sadly, I have no details on the content of those letters. And Lehman disappears from my sources once he is released on May 23rd, 1917. But nonetheless, I'm still intrigued by the evidence of a Catholic African-American man, a pianist, and a drugstore clerk born from Lutheran German immigrants. Both of them making friends in a federal prison after selling cocaine, and in the case of Blue, other narcotics. But it begs the question, did the pianist and the drug clerk ever cross paths after returning to their families in Chicago? Now, that may sound like a strange, arbitrary question, but the reason I have this interest in the mingling of their occupations is because the research I've conducted thus far with these federal prison records has led me to formulate a hypothesis. At Leavenworth, roughly 51,000 numbers were distributed between April 29th, 1911 and December 31st, 1941. That's prisoner numbers. And my preliminary reading of this data identified roughly 8,000 prisoners that were associated with violations of federal drug laws. Now, just a caveat, those are findings as of today, 9/24/20. I may find more. I doubt I'm going to find less. I think I probably will find more. What I could learn about, my question is, what could I learn about the division of labor sustaining the operations or structure of the illegal drug market through tabulating the declared occupation of each of these prisoners? Could a prisoner's declared occupation give any insight into their place within the illegal market's supply chain? Was there a relationship between the race of the dealer and their declared occupations? I suspect the answer will be yes, and I hypothesize that the biggest racial deviations will be found at the two ends of an occupational spectrum. On one end are the pharmacists and physicians engaged in large transactions, who I suspect will likely be white. And on the other, I expect to see generally more racial diversity with the service sector. You know, the bellhops, cooks, waiters, drivers, maids, laundry workers, porters, and musicians, all who make small transactions within hospitality or social or entertainment venues. So in a sense, I anticipate the illegal market structure to generally emulate the racial distribution of occupations within the broader American economy of the early 20th century. I emphasize generally here because the history of the drug business on both sides of the legal and illegal divide have occasionally witnessed the emergence of kingpins from humble beginnings. Probably the most iconic example of that in the history of American drug dealing would be the once illiterate car thief who became Freeway Ricky Ross, a man who supposedly made $900 million in gross earnings after distributing 3 tons of Colombian cocaine between the years 1982 and 1989. To wrap up, there are a number of contributions this portion of my manuscript research can make to the field, as far as I can see. In terms of historiography, this research can test the canonical argument about the starting point of what David Courtwright termed the classic era of narcotic control, potentially being able to track different transition times across different geographic zones. In my case, I think that in the case of Chicago, you can make the argument that classic narcotic control really started to kick off in 1923. I'm still trying to figure that out. Another contribution is a methodological one. This work opens up a new way of asking questions about the nature of or business or social relationships that crossed over the boundaries between legal and illegal markets. The caveat I would put here is that that the researcher has to plan for the problem of selection bias and apply scrutiny when reading these prisoner files. And lastly, I think in terms of theory, this work can contribute to theorizing a 20th century narrative that conjoins the history of the pharmaceutical industry with the political economy of race in America. With that being said, I just want to thank everyone again and open up the floor for questions when the time comes. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for this presentation and indeed for keeping up with the time frame. We will have only one discussion at the end, so I would like to ask everybody to remember questions and remarks, but you'll also be happy to already write your questions and remarks in the chat window. So there the questions will be collected and answered at the end. So we immediately move forward to the next presentation, which is given by Joseph Gabriel. Joseph Gabriel received his education in history and philosophy at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and received his PhD from the Department of History and Rutgers University. I would like to point out that, in fact, he held the George Ordang Chair for the History of Pharmacy in Madison for 2 years in 2015 and 16, before he went back to the Sunshine State in Florida, where he's now keep on working. He's associate professor at 2 departments, the Department of Behavioral Science and Social Medicine and the Department of History at Florida State University. Today's presentation is entitled Dangerous Markets, Risk and the Origin of Ethical Pharmacy. Joseph, please.
Hey, thank you. Everybody can hear me okay? Take it. Let me know if you can't. So good afternoon and good evening to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And Richard, thank you for that really interesting presentation of your work. I think Richard's work and mine complement each other's in some really useful kinds of ways. I don't have a PowerPoint for you today, but I did invite my friend Pikachu to join us and entertain you if I get too boring. So say hello, Pikachu. Hi, everybody. Okay, anyway. So I'm currently working on a paper that I'm going to tentatively call Dangerous Markets, Proprietary Medicines, and the Search for an Ethical Pharmacy. And I'm hoping to submit the paper to Pharmacy and History sometime soon. And this is part of a book project that I'm currently working on, which deals with intellectual property rights and the pharmaceutical industry during the interwar period, from about 1917 to 1945 or so. So in many ways, this paper is, and a larger book project, are a continuation of my earlier work, which some of you may be familiar with. What I'm going to do today is just kind of briefly outline the paper and some of the arguments that I'm working on for it. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions or discussion after. And I could use your help in some kind of specific areas if we have time for that. Okay, so my focus in this paper is on the United States during the period from World War I and World War II. The broad story that I'm trying to tell is about the rise of so-called proprietary medicines during the interwar period, and the way that the growing importance of these products in pharmaceutical markets created various types of risk and dangers for retail pharmacists, and also then how pharmacists responded to these dangers. So in the first section of the paper, I'm going to kind of briefly describe the development of proprietary drugs in the United States. And basically, proprietary drugs were products that were sold under scientific sounding and trademarked names, and that could therefore be claimed as belonging to the manufacturer in some important sense, even if they were essentially the same product as other goods sold under different proprietary names. Okay. Right, so this is about trademark rights in particular, and trademark rights being applied at the level of the product as opposed to the company, the level of the company. So historians who work on the United States pharmaceutical markets often think of drug manufacturing in the United States during the 19th and early 20th centuries as being divided into 2 basic sectors, right? There's the so-called ethical wing of the industry, companies like Parke-Davis that Richard mentioned on the one hand, and so-called patent medicine manufacturers on the other. Now, in other places, I've argued that in the late 19th century, both wings of the industry began to trademark their products in new ways, and in particular to apply trademarks at the level of the individual product. Okay? Excuse me. This is a very complicated process, but one of the consequences of this was that there wasn't really a sense of generic names in the way that we understand it today. Okay? There are various types of non-proprietary names, which I'm happy to talk about, but there was no real coherent system for establishing non-proprietary names, and non-proprietary names weren't standardized or really even stable in the way that we assume they are today. Okay? So over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you have the growing use of trademark and proprietary names that operate at the level of the product, and at the same time, you have this sort of haphazard system of sometimes assigning non-proprietary names to new products and sometimes not assigning them, and different pathways to creating non-proprietary names. Okay. So in this paper, I'm going to argue that during the interwar period, the distinction between so-called ethical drug manufacturing on the one hand and so-called patent manufacturing on the other really began to collapse as the two wings of the industry both embraced the use of scientific-sounding and trademarked names that they applied to the level of the product. Now, obviously, there continue to be important differences between the two types of manufacturers, right? So there's important differences between Parke-Davis and the Lydian Pinkham Company, for example. But the growing use of proprietary names meant that these two wings were actually a lot closer to one another than we are used to typically thinking of, right? I'm not completely solid on the numbers yet, and I could use some help in this area. But I think that by about the mid-1920s, about 25% of goods that were sold in legal markets in the United States were proprietary in nature, right? In other words, they were sold under trademark names at the level of the product, right? So this represented the eclipse of older and different types of pharmaceutical products, right? During the 19th century, I think there were basically three kinds of products that dominated the market, right? There were raw botanicals, there were patent medicines, and then there were manufactured goods that were sold under non-proprietary names, like elixir, juniper, or something like that, right? But by the 1920s, these older types of goods are starting to be replaced rapidly by manufactured goods, often with very complex ingredients, that are sold under scientific-sounding names that are trademarked, right, and therefore associated with specific companies. So I'm going to argue that the rise of proprietary drugs in the interwar period was intertwined with a variety of other kind of large structural changes in the drug market that those of us working in the U.S. context are probably familiar with, right? Like things like the growth of chain drugstores, price cutting, the use of loss leaders, the fight over resale price maintenance, and so on. For historians of pharmacy who work on the U.S., I think these are, probably familiar topics, right? But I also think that a focus on proprietary drugs as kind of an analytic lens and the transformation of the drug market in that sense during this period brings to light a variety of other issues that have gotten less attention from historians. I personally am particularly interested in what I see as a really very significant confusion over drug nomenclature during this period, including the rapid development of numerous products with very similar sounding trademark names, and in particular the ongoing problem of non-proprietary names, right? The ongoing problem being that, on the one hand, you have a massive increase and proliferation of proprietary names, and on the other, you have a lack of any kind of systematized or coherent system for generating and standardizing commercially and therapeutically useful non-proprietary names. Okay? And this sort of problem, right, led to all kinds of troubles for pharmacists and their customers. Okay, These problems included, issues related to standardization, equivalence between products that were sold under different names, many very similar sounding names that, sounded the same, but were applied to different kinds of things, counterfeiting, and other types of issues. Okay. So these issues, all these kind of issues, in turn, introduced different types of risk to various actors in the pharmaceutical market, right, including retail pharmacists. So, for example, right, the proliferation of very similar sounding proprietary names for products of varying strengths and effects increased the risk of prescribing or distribution error leading to customer harm, right? And in doing so, raised the legal question of pharmacist responsibility for that harm, right? So, for example, did a pharmacist have a legal duty to warn customers when a physician had obviously prescribed the wrong drug for a medical problem? Did a pharmacist have the legal right to substitute one drug for another if doing so would mitigate risk to the customer? Who was responsible when someone died from using one of the products a pharmacist sold? Right? What were the differences between being a pharmacist on the one hand and being a so-called drug dealer on the other? And this, by the way, is why I think Richard's work is really very interesting and actually really quite important. As Richard's work shows, these types of legal questions brought very real legal risks to retail pharmacists as they went about their daily business, right? And so pharmacists, in turn, went about trying to reform and shape the market to their own ends, to their own professional interests. Okay, so I'll kind of quickly go over the second two parts because I think I'm already running out of time. The second part of the paper, I want to talk about what I call the crisis of retail pharmacy, and in particular the way that proprietary goods seem to threaten pharmacists in a variety of ways. Right? This included both economic and legal risk, but it also included a sort of risk to one's own professional identity and sense of self-worth. Right? Proprietary medicines profoundly altered the nature of pharmacy practice. And they worked to convert pharmacists from someone skilled in the art of compounding to someone who was, from the perspective of critics, little more than a retail clerk who sold products that were manufactured by forces beyond his control. And not just any retail clerk, right? A retail clerk who worked long and monotonous hours, faced extremely difficult economic prospects, and was exposed to a variety of legal dangers due to the nature of the products and his relationship to other actors in the developing pharmaceutical system, including physicians, regulators, and members of the public who were increasingly able to pursue legal remedies against pharmacists through the development of personal injury law, the doctrine of informed consent, and other legal mechanisms. Okay, so if I ever actually finish this paper, which, let's hope so, right? But if I ever actually finish it, the third section of the paper will discuss efforts by reformers to address these kind of problems, right? These responses included the fight for resale price maintenance, the diversification of store inventories, even the embrace of modern sales techniques such as window displays. For some reformers, though, right, some reformers tried to establish some kind of pharmacy practice that distanced them from proprietary medicines and from the workings of the market, right, by emphasizing the development of what they called ethical pharmacy. Now, an ethical pharmacy could mean a variety of things. For some reformers, it meant pharmacy practice that only sold compounded or pharmacopoeial products made according to pharmacopoeial standards. For others, it meant distinguishing the selling of drugs from the selling of other products, like fountain soda, perhaps by keeping them in different portions of the store or eliminating them from pharmacies altogether. For some reformers, ethical pharmacy meant improving standards in pharmacy schools or improving compounding skills for retail pharmacists. And for others, it meant refusing to prescribe or to substitute or to use counterfeit products. For some, it meant refusing to sell dangerous goods to disreputable or otherwise problematic customers. Okay? So there's a whole variety of ideas about what ethical pharmacy could be, right? But for some reformers, a truly ethical pharmacy simply meant the separation of pharmacy practice from what they understood as commercial settings altogether. Okay? So in other words, the transformation of pharmacy from an explicitly commercial practice located in the drugstore to a clinical practice located in the hospital or the clinic. Okay? So that move to try to establish a so-called ethical pharmacy is, I think, where I'll probably end the paper. And I'll probably end with the effort to develop hospital pharmacy as a distinct specialty during the 1930s. And then continue search for a pharmacy practice today that is supposedly free from the operations of the market, right? But of course, it never was, right? Because hospitals and clinics are not actually free from the market, right? And so another sort of alternate ending, and this is where I'll end, but another alternate ending is with the origins of the generic drug industry in the interwar period. Most historians date the origins of the generic industry in its modern form to the post-World War II period. But I think that during this period, during the interwar period, a small handful of manufacturers appear to have recognized that manufacturing and selling drugs under non-proprietary names represented a new market opportunity, right? So there's this whole shift taking place towards proprietary medicines. And as that takes place, a handful of manufacturers recognize that the shifting commercial and ethical landscape within pharmacy represents a new market opportunity. And these companies appear to have actively appropriated the names of products sold by other companies under the assumption or under the argument that these names had entered the public domain. I'm going to write specifically about a company called Blackman & Blackman, which at some point in the 1930s changed its names to Primo Pharmaceutical Laboratories, I think, if I have the timeline right. Primo then went on to become one of the main generic drug manufacturers in the United States between World War II and the 1980s. And I found a number of legal cases where Blackman & Blackman and Primo were involved in appropriating names for products that were already on the market and treating them as non-proprietary names and selling them as non-proprietary names, right? So as what we would call generic names. Okay, so I'll end there. And thank you for your attention. And I look forward to any comments or questions at the end of the session.
Dr. Thanks a lot for your presentation, for really great contents and even for sticking to the time frame. One remark for all the visitors, please start writing questions in the chat window so that we can have a lively discussion after the third presentation, which I'm going to introduce now. It's given by Mariana Broglia de Moura. She's working in Paris at the École des Hautes Études de Sciences Sociales, and she received her master's degree in history there as well, and she's now working at the PhD program there. Unfortunately, she recently changed the title of her presentation, so it's totally different from the abstracts. I try to make my notes on that. Oh, great! Yeah, now it is called "Pharmacist's Performance Behind the Iron Curtain," control of pharmaceutical practices during the Brazilian dictatorship. So we will get a presentation from Paris about pharmaceutical history in Brazil. Mariana.
Thank you very much. So in this presentation, I will study how the Brazilian military dictatorship led to a reorientation of the repressive apparatus towards pharmaceutical practices in the name of the fight against the drugs, subversion, and corruption. And I don't know why I can pass my PowerPoint. I don't know why. Yes, sorry. So such an evolution which reinforces the control and repression over pharmacists, but also over the very public agents that were supposed to regulate them, undermines another process that began during the 30s, which aimed at clearly defining the legitimate actors who had access to the illicit market of drugs, and at concentrating their regulation in the hands of state agencies and of peer professionals. So to sum up this process in 2 words, the period between 30s and early 60s was marked by the construction of a difficult compromise between the state and pharmacy professionals, the formation of a licit market of drugs, and the will to avoid the deviation from this market to illicit uses imply a strict regulation and control of pharmacies, initially exercised by police officers and then by inspectors from health agencies. So pharmacists occupy a key and ambiguous position. They had privileged access to drugs and could deviate it to an illicit market or to inappropriate uses. So the pharmacy itself had an ambiguous status between a commercial establishment and a health service. Most pharmacy owners were in practice laymen, not pharmacists. For this reason, it was not very clear if they should be treated in case of suspicious activities in relation to drugs as laymen or as a health professional. Pharmacists insisted on the fact that they wanted to be controlled only by a competent health authority, and they also insisted on the fact that a control by peers was central to resolving these ambiguities on the basis of a clear division between drugs and medicine, laymen and professionals. This long process of negotiation eventually led to a compromise between these professionals and the state control agencies, and the creation in 1960 of the regional and the federal pharmaceutical councils, designed to ensure the technical and ethical principles of the profession distinguish it very clearly from the layman. This council worked in conjunction with state agencies such as the National Medical and Pharmacy Control Service and the National Commission for Drug Control, created in 30s, to strengthen control over professionals. This double system of control clearly separated health and pharmaceutical professionals from laymen and instituted a series of filters to manage differentially their illegalism in relation to drugs by reinforcing a boundary between illegal drugs and medicine. This compromise relied not only on a contractual and technical commitment to respect the formal rules of the drug control system, to direct drugs exclusively to medical scientific needs and prescribe them appropriately, but also as a moral commitment not to take advantage of their privileged access to diverse drugs. It helped to manage a series of conducts at the margins of the laws and which could be treated either as a crime in alignment with illegal trafficking or or as professional mistakes. So to put it in the Foucauldian framework that has been widely used recently to study white-collar crimes, such a compromise ensured a differential management of illegalism according to boundaries as laymen and professionals, illegal drugs, and illicit medicine. The notion of illegalism applies to all practices that are located at the margins of the law and play with norms and laws without being necessarily defined as a crime. It insists on the fact that their very definition as a crime or not depends on a dynamic process which depends on the status of the agent's economic and power relationships. They hence can be subject to differential management. So differential management of illegalism in this case is not the simple penal selectivity that would lead, for example, to the punishment of some individuals and the impunity of others. But it also refers to the process of coding and translating certain activities into the language of the law. Some practices, despite being in fact analogous to those of trafficking because they are practiced by health and pharmaceutical professionals, are not necessarily typified as a crime in their own right. They have a specific status and can be judged separately, at least as long as the compromise we've described is enforced. However, when such a compromise is questioned, as it's the case during the dictatorship, such a differentiated management becomes contested and the illegalism are exposed to a new political and repressive game. Dictatorship, through its fight against subversion, corruption, and in its war on drugs, as a threat to national safety, will lead to a deep redefinition of the ways to deal with pharmacist activities and the potential illegalism, questioning the boundaries between laymen and professionals, and even focusing on the very state agents who were in charge of controlling the professionals. The dictatorial regime established a continuity between laymen and professional practice and delegitimized the mentioned compromise for several reasons. First of all, from 1967 onwards, the regime deeply modified the equilibrium between repressive and cultural agencies by investing all the civil ministries, such as health or justice, with security and information divisions, an apparatus designed to monitor and provide intelligence on civilian practices at all levels, from laymen to the head of civil agencies in name of a fight against corruption and subversion. At the same time, the regime proceeded to a complex institutional transformation in the field of drug control that, on the one hand, relegated traditional state control agencies as a mere technical service inside the health ministry. And on the other hand, the police and repressive apparatus gained autonomy and supremacy on these institutions, especially through the articulation of the war on drugs and the regime's political ideology, based largely on the doctrine of revolutionary war, which considered drugs as weapon of communist subversion carried by the internal enemy with the aim of weakening nation's body and the values and corrupting social institutions as family, health, education. Unlike various Brazilian scholars who tend to focus on this period as founding moment in what they call the bellicist turn of Brazilian drug policies characterized by prohibition and a strong repressive policy against drugs addicts and traffickers, through a military apparatus directed against Brazilian population and in particular its poor and racialized fringes, we will show some cases which reveal that Brazilian dictatorships, war on drugs, subversion, and corruption also focused on pharmacists and health inspectors who were also put under scrutiny and treated in alignment with subversive agents, lay trafficker, or corrupt agents. So, as we've seen before, the interpretative margin in the management of drugs illegalism raised the question of which institution was the more legitimate to impose its interpretation and determine how this illegalism should be treated. Either the state health control agencies, which tended to interpret them as a professional offenses, or the various new repressive agencies, particularly concerned with the subversive activities of drug users and which tracked down illegal behaviors inside pharmacies, hence instituting a clearly continuity between lay traffickers and pharmacists. This is, for instance, the case of the Operation Detachment of Information, the armed wing of the repression, which arrested a woman in Rio de Janeiro, I quote, initially suspected of subversive activities, who is flawed in toxic substance and supplies herself without a medical prescription with a material to satisfy her vice at the following address. So, as we can see, in this case, no distinction is made between pharmacists and other traffickers. The situation gets even more complicated when the illegalism practiced by pharmacists are interpreted as a part of a broader strategy of subversion and as a political crime. Various denunciations show that pharmacists, because they could personify a civilian economic and political elite which was contested by dictatorship, were good targets of repressive authorities, especially when they accumulate economic and political statuses. This is the case of a pharmacist, former mayor in Paraná. I quote, according to information obtained in the city, propaganda pamphlets were distributed. They were put in the medicine packets when the prescription was issued. He was carrying out a communist and subversive propaganda through the pharmacy on his property by distributing books of undoubtedly revolutionary character, even among children. And this case illustrates perfectly how the diffusion of drugs and of suspicious subversive doctrines, both accused to subvert the national body and in particular its CEO, are linked together by dictatorship agencies. Mirroring this example, we find other accusations that show how these denunciations were embedded in a complex game in which some pharmacists may use strategically the political grammar of subversion to weaken some competitors. This is the case of a pharmacist Chinese who sent a letter of denunciation accusing the Regional Council of Pharmacy for having been for 11 years, I quote, led by communist elements in collusion with the Federal Council of Pharmacy. The communist leader is the major pharmacist of the military police who illegally occupies the post of pharmacist of the Health Secretariat of the State of Rio de Janeiro. The vice communist leader is the pharmacist of the Division of Medical Control, who is candidate for federal councillor despite being linked to a dozen pharmaceutical companies. End of quote. So a few days later, the Central Agent of the National Information Service asked for an investigation on these individuals, which established that, I quote, the author of the denunciation letter is already a well-known element. His real aim is quite clear: to become known to the authorities in order later to gain benefits and exert pressure on the members of the Regional Pharmacy Council, thereby obtain individual benefits. end of quote. So in this case, this caricatural example shows to what extent the political grammar of subversion and the apparatus of control let down by the dictatorship could be invested by some actors to strategically move in the professional field. The control of the profession was linked to the imperative of moralization and politics and the fight against corruption or use of the state as a way for personal benefit that was at the core of the dictatorship ideology. Military officials were not only concerned with subversion and fight against communism, but also with corruption, which they consider as major obstacle for Brazilian progress. This led to a particular focus on civil state agents who were at the core of the regulation of the legal market of drugs. A file of 1,020 pages with photographs denounced, for instance, in 1979, a case of corruption with the very central of medicine, CIMI. So this case shows how the development of a state-controlled market of drugs facilitates illegalism of a political and economic elite which use the position it occupies to give access to the market through the distribution of authorization and visas and enriched themselves this way. This case applies to Paulo Roberto, the president of the CIMI Licensing Commission, and Arthur Fernandes, his intermediary in negotiations with the various CIMI suppliers companies. Paulo Roberto gave the impression that he was a civil servant in a precarious financial situation, living on rent with his wife, Tânia, a civil servant too, and his children, and with an outstanding debt of 80,000 cruzeiros with the Bank of Brazil. But he was actually a millionaire who had made his fortune from the sale and negotiation of authorization that allowed pharmaceutical companies to gain privileged position in the state drug market. After a long and detailed investigation, the government came to the conclusion that, I quote, Paulo Roberto, as president of the Licensing Commission of the CIMI, and Tânia, as secretary to the minister, have practiced acts of corruption in the CIMI. She, Tânia, maintains love affairs with some government members and promotes the corrupt acts of her husband, Paulo Roberto. Roberto, together with the drug addict and pederast Arthur Fernandes de Freitas, has established contacts with traders from various pharmaceutical corporations. Until October of 1979, Paulo Roberto and Arthur received bribes from these laboratories of a minimum amount of 2,060,000 cruzeiros to favor them in the actions carried out by the CIMI. End of quote. So, unfortunately, due to the investigative nature of these archives, we do not have the procedural follow-up for this case. What we do know, however, is how the dictatorial structure, which allowed for new frauds, crimes, and irregularities, but also strategic denunciations and accusations, as a result of the inflation of surveillance and repression bodies, has allowed the development of a complex interplay of agents at the margins of political and economic power. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mariana. I think you saw my secret messages to keep your time frame. Yeah? Okay. Great. So we are about 1 o'clock or 8 o'clock German time. So we, in fact, came to the end of the session. But Lucas allowed us to exceed for some minutes. And so we will be able, in fact, to ask some questions or make some remarks. There are just two so far in the chat frame. One is from my old friend Greg Higby, and it goes to Professor Gabriel. Could you name a good example trade market product from this period? And in brackets, adrenaline and luminol come to mind. I would like to add some from my viewpoint related to aspirin. Aspirin has been invented by the Bayer company, and the trademark aspirin has been secured for Germany and Europe, I suggest, but never in the US. And this led to the fact that acetylic salicylic acid is still named aspirin as a generic name in US literature, because in Europe it's a trade name for the Bayer company. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm writing about aspirin fairly significantly in my book project, and aspirin was involved in some very significant trademark disputes in the U.S. And even though it was not trademarked, it was protected by what's called the doctrine of secondary significance in anti-competition law. And so there was a very kind of important legal question about control of the name that got decided in a 1917 court case that had very kind of significant implications for how generic names operated down the road. So, and then another thing about aspirin is that it's very interesting because it was actually, when it was first introduced, it was a major source of counterfeiting in the United States. And there were and Bayer actually worked with police forces in the early 20th century to arrest pharmacists who were importing aspirin from Canada and selling it supposedly contrary to their patent rights. So I mean, there's all kinds of products, like, you know, at this point of time that are trademarked. You know, Greg, one that you might be interested in particular is ethyl 1-methylbutyric acid, which was developed by Abbott working with Arthur Tatum, who's at the University of Wisconsin. And Abbott trademarked it. The guy at the Mayo Clinic gave it the name Nembutal, and then Abbott trademarked the name Nembutal. And then there was a legal dispute over the name, whether it was a generic name or a non-proprietary name or a commercial name. The Abbott then submitted it to the Council of Pharmacy and Chemistry, and the Council of Pharmacy and Chemistry coined a non-proprietary name for it, pentobarbital, which, you know, is kind of now the generic name, right? You know, another good example are the digitalis products. By the 1920s, there were, at least 20 different digitalis products on the market under trademark names with names like digitalin, digitoxin. I'm sorry, those are the descriptive names. Digilin, digifortis, digitol, digichafin, digilutin, digipotent, digipurpurum.
These are they are chemically different, so
and so on, right? And these are all different products with different strengths and different effects, and very easy to confuse, right?
Do you know of if the introduction of the International Non-Proprietary Name (INN) system in 1950 has to do with these uncertainties and development?
Yeah, it does, but I don't really understand that story that well. But there's like this issue plays out in different national contexts in different ways, and there's a kind of a general international reform movement to establish uniform pharmacopoeial names that are different from the national pharmacopoeias. That goes all the way back to the late 19th century and then kind of culminates in 1950.
Okay. There's a question from Mariana. Have you come across any sources that describe the public's embrace, rejection, or reinterpretation of the Brazilian regime's claims about socialist subversives weaponizing drugs?
Yes, there's some denunciation coming from individuals, and for example, the example that I give here. was the example where the denunciation comes from the individuals or the peers, the pharmacists inside the council or some different kind of individuals up there to these discourses and this kind of ideology, political ideology in the dictatorship.
Okay, I'm happy that there's a question for Richard as well. Question for Richard. Do you see any connections between your research about organized groups of drug dealers in the early 20th century and the well-known rise of Chicago organized crime during Prohibition?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think a certain rhythm or operating pattern becomes established, but it's not the same actors over the years. People, if, for example, it gets to a point where if someone is a subsistence dealer, someone who has an addiction and they're dealing to just cater to their own needs, their time of success and being able to organize crime is very limited. They usually burn out after a number of years. Certainly, you'll see people who may get arrested in 1915, 1916, only to reemerge in the prisons in 1928, a little wiser, a little smarter. But something that's happening during this time period that also shifts the networks that I can't speak to as of this moment is that we start talking about dealers trading in drugs that aren't manufactured in the United States. You'll start seeing drugs being manufactured sometimes by European professionals in Central Asia or Turkey or even south of the border in Central America. So this changes the networks as well, and I think that's one of the things that kind of stands out, because eventually this microcosm, this embryonic pattern that I'm describing 100 years ago, evolves and grows to now, instead of using American manufacturers, now you have no choice, but you have to find illegal manufacturers of your own from outside the boundaries of the country. So again, it's the Germans would call it Jein, right? Ja and Nein, Jein.
Okay.
So
it often depends on the wording and the shift of significance of a word. You're talking, you imagine that the term dealer was neutral at the beginning, but turned as a criminalization instrument or things like that. And the same word drug in Germany is Droge, and it comes from dry, simply because vegetables have been dried before they've been sold in a pharmacy. And so chamomile tea in Germany is a drug, Droge. Yeah? This is totally different in pharmaceutical practice than in general practice. Yeah? So there's a significant shift in wording itself. Yeah? I think we should end with another question for Joseph. It's from John Swan. You can read it in the chat window yourself. Have you perceived any particular impact on the growing acceptance of proprietary nomenclature with the AMA Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry role in including agreed upon names as part of their acceptance program 1905? And I wonder how much agreement, disagreement there was on the council. Rather complicated. Most probably you should read it yourself.
Yeah, I don't see the question in my chat box, but by the 1920s, the Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry had clearly accepted patenting as non-problematic, right? But trademarks were significantly more complicated and difficult to work out, and there was a lot of controversy about them. And they end up creating a whole set of rules from about 1906 to all the way up until the 30s they create a whole kind of set of rules about how to handle the issue of non-proprietary names. And they become one of the sources, trademark names, and they become one of the main sources for the generation and coining of non-proprietary names. Like in the Nembutal case, where they coin the name pentobarbital for it, and then they try to popularize that name, but they usually can't do so very successfully.
Yeah, I think we should end with the official session now. There's another comment in the chat box for you, but the session was scheduled until 1 o'clock, and we have been allowed to exceed by 5 minutes. Now we exceeded 10 minutes. So I thank all the participants for their contributions, and I think, as Lucas said, in the morning we will all be able to make contact and stay in contact and deepen our discussions. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.